Thomas and Friends, Danger at the Docks is another Thomas collection. This was released in 2018. It's directed by Dianna, Basso and Don Spencer, and in the description I'll put a list of the UK and US voice actors. I grew up watching a lot of Thomas, the original classic Thomas of course, and I love watching these collections to see how educational the episodes still are, and also to get a bit of nostalgia. There are certain characters that do bring me a lot of nostalgia. In this particular collection, there are definitely characters I wasn't familiar with growing up, and there are some really great stories in here. I think there are 1 or 2 weak links that I wasn't particularly bothered about, but in general, I really enjoyed these. So, as usual, I will go through the episodes and share some basic thoughts. I won't go into any major details. While I won't spoil each episode, there are some spoilers in some episodes for the previous episode, so that's just worth bearing in mind. And generally it is a really good selection. So the first episode is Cranky at the end of the line. Cranky is worried he'll be replaced with a new shiny crane. And needless to say, this is now more than ever a fear for all of us. While it's best to not let young children worry about the current job market and the fact that shiny robots are taking over our jobs, I do think that it is a good story with a good lesson about not necessarily jumping to the worst possible conclusion, because that's what Cranky did. Without gathering the facts, he just assumed the worst. And it's a good lesson, yes, for the target audience, but for all of us to try and not assume the worst, because you never know what's around the corner. Then we have New Crane on the Dock, which is a bit of a spoiler for the previous episode. And there is indeed a new crane. This is Carly, and it's all about her finding her place. And honestly, I didn't care for the character. I don't hate her, but I wasn't really a fan of her. But as an introduction to the character, I think it did a good job. I think it did a good job of introducing the character to viewers. I don't mind the character design, so not really a problem, but I don't think the episode was necessarily the strongest, but I certainly didn't dislike it. Then we come to Stuck in Gear. And Harvey is a beautiful engine, a gorgeous design, but he doesn't like people looking at him, and he doesn't want to make a fuss. When something doesn't go quite right, he tries to fix it himself because he doesn't want that attention, but he ends up making it worse. There is a brilliant message here about asking for help, and also an important message about the fact that not everybody wants to be the centre of attention, even if they do look unique and beautiful. And I think that that's really important, because I find that, speaking as an introvert, I find that extroverts sometimes don't really realise that it's okay to not want to be the centre of attention or not want any kind of attention. And I think for young children who might be used to having that extrovert personality, if they then have a friend who is quite shy or reserved and they don't like attention, they might not automatically pick up on that. So I think that that's a really great message for anybody, but particularly for young children who might have a friend who is, to some extent, like Harvey. So this was a decent episode. Then we come to A Most Singular Engine. Daisy and Harvey are both unique engines, and when they meet, it's unclear for a moment whether they'll be friends or foe, but it's a good story about accepting that people can bring different things and be unique in their own way. And you could be friends with somebody even if you're different. Great characters, nice story. I like the fact that it shows that there are different kinds of uniqueness. Everybody can stand out in their own way. I think the way the engines handled things was really great. The pacing was good. It was a nice little story. Then we have Springtime for Diesel. This narrative felt a little bit flat, a little bit underdeveloped. Diesel charges around and bumps into Daisy. There's some damage and Daisy dramatically wonders if this is the end of the line for her. Honestly, it's a bit of a dull story though. And obviously we have an important message. Don't charge around because you might injure somebody and they might start to be all dramatic about it. Or worse, you might actually injure them. But at the same time, I don't think the narrative was actually that engaging. So it could be stronger, but they are delivering an important message. So I guess that's not too bad. Then we have number 6, Den and Dart. And I found this one to be really dull. Again, a good message, but the story for me wasn't that engaging, and I also don't care for the characters. I don't dislike them, but I wasn't that bothered. They work separately. After working together, they decide to work separately, but ultimately learn about the joy of working together. I think there's a good message there for the target audience who might want to do everything independently, but actually if you work together, you can have a good time. It's not engaging. I thought the characters were dull, but the messages, I guess, are pretty decent. And then we come to the last one. I loved it, but I hated one aspect of it. But it is a spoiler, so I will discuss that at the end. Philip's number. This one is a great story. Philip wants to know why he's number 68. Philip is adorable, and he rides around looking at numbers, and I think that's a great way to encourage children to look at the world around them and identify different numbers. It's a great way to keep children occupied when you're out and about. See how many numbers you can identify. Obviously a great way to start recognizing numbers and learning about what some of them mean. And that's a really great element. It is quite brief in this episode, but it's there, so I'm going to praise it. And ultimately, Philip learns to accept his number, rather than feeling sad about the fact that he's not number 1 or not a higher number. And I love that. It's about learning to accept who he is. And I won't say exactly what happens, but there is part of the narrative that allows him to feel important for being number 68. So it's not just about accepting it, but about embracing it. And that message is fantastic for anybody of any age, but again, particularly for the target audience. I think that that's fantastic. However, I was a little bit disappointed, and this is a big spoiler, so I will wrap up the whole of this discussion first, then I'll go in with the spoiler. In general, Danger at the Docks is a decent collection. A bit of an interesting title. There wasn't a lot of danger, to be particularly honest. But either way, it's a decent collection. There are some really good episodes there, some really solid messages, 1 or 2 slightly dull episodes, but ultimately nothing was bad. Oh, and the animation is great, voice acting is great, no problems there. So, a big spoiler for what happens at the end of Philip's number. He doesn't find out why he is number 68. The Fat Controller, or I guess Mr. Topham Hat, approaches him to say, oh, by the way, I found out. And then Philip says, no, it's okay. I don't want to know. I've accepted I'm number 68 because of this thing that happens, which I like. I do applaud that attitude. But as a viewer, I spent the entire episode wondering why he was number 68, and we never found out. And that is so infuriating. He could have found out. It could have been a really mundane reason, such as just he was the 68th engine, or I don't know, it could have been the age of the person who created it. This is a ridiculous answer, but I don't know. There could have been a reason that wasn't going to affect his emotions, and he still could have had the same outcome. But I, as a viewer, really wanted to know, and I found it very irritating that we never got that conclusion. Thankfully, we live in the age of the internet, and I googled it, and apparently a couple of sources say this. I haven't completely fact-checked it, but a few places do say that Philip was actually number 68 because within the show, he is the 68th standard gauge engine introduced in the series. And if that is true, that's pretty awesome. How would they have explained it in the episode? I don't know. But if that is true, that is pretty cool. Thankfully, we have some semblance of an answer. And ultimately, Thomas and Friends, Danger at the Docks was a really decent collection of episodes.